Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We want to welcome you to the Cultures of Correspondence Symposium Part 1, hosted by the Armstrong Browning Library at Baylor University, just in case you weren't sure where you were at this moment. We're looking forward to the next day and today's sort of keynotes and roundtables, luncheons and workshops with you all. I wanted to give you just a brief history of kind of where this came from, this idea for the symposium. In December of 2023, Mara Ives and Susan Egenoff, who are there with us in the sort of back middle there, emailed to say that they were, quote, hoping to put together a symposium on Victorian letters, and would I be interested in collaborating? I had just recently started my position here at the ABL as Margaret Root Brown Chair, so my first thought was, let me shoot an email to Jennifer Borderud, the director of the library. I was curious about my initial response, so I went back and found that email. And I said to Jennifer, this sounds exciting, right? And indeed, it was exciting. And as you can imagine, it is very exciting to see it come to fruition 14 months later. The beginning stages of our planning were driven by the questions about the state of letters and correspondence in our field, both in terms of research projects as well as curation of these collections in digital and physical archives. When we began thinking of our audience for the symposium, we also realized it can be very difficult to figure out who is working in this area. So how does one find scholars doing this work? How does one find where these collections of letters live? Where does one turn for collaborative partners when trying to overcome institutional and financial barriers to preserving and working with letters? So these initial questions are what drove the keynotes and the roundtables that we've organized here at Baylor this weekend and A&M next weekend. We're eager to learn from our speakers and from all of you and to see where these conversations take us. We hope that the start of this symposium is a start of something important for all of us working with collections of correspondence. But now I'm delighted to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, Dr. Anne Longmuir, and we're going to put up her presentation so you can see it. I had the pleasure of hearing Anne present at the British Women Writers Conference this past June, when my mind was full of these questions that we raised about the symposium. Dr. Longmuir's presentation engaged with some of these very questions. So naturally, at the conference banquet, I ambushed her and said, I need to talk to you. So I'll be emailing you later, and then scurried off. And I'm sure Anne was wondering, what in the world am I talking about? But Anne, as you will see, is a very gracious and generous scholar in person. And so when I did email to ask her if she would be a keynote for our symposium, she gave me an enthusiastic yes. So I'm very excited to learn from her, and I hope all of you will find time to engage with her over the course of the next day and a half. Dr. Longmuir is a professor of English at Kansas State University. She's published articles and book chapters on Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, Wilkie Collins, and others. Her most recent book, John Ruskin and the Victorian Woman Writer, explores the personal and literary relationships of Victorian art critic and social theorist John Ruskin with 4 major 19th century women writers. And as you can see today, her presentation will focus on Elizabeth Gaskell. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Longmuir up.
Hello, and first of all, let me begin by thanking Dr. Pond for that very generous introduction, and also for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here at the Cultures of Correspondence Symposium. It's a real pleasure to be back at Baylor and to be back at the Armstrong Browning Library as well. And I'm looking forward to talking about reading other people's mail with you for the next couple of days. So I'm someone who sort of fell into the study of correspondence kind of by accident. And I actually think that's maybe not uncommon. So it started off with my research on Elizabeth Gaskell's fiction and its relationship to John Ruskin's political economy. And that research led me to their correspondence and then to their friendship. In turn, that prompted my reassessment of Ruskin's relationships with women writers in the mid-19th century, and that became my subsequent book. The book itself draws extensively on correspondence to think about these professional, political, literary, and social relationships. And as a result of doing that research, I have become familiar with the kind of practical and theoretical difficulties associated with letters, right? So from indecipherable handwriting to unreliable transcripts to the thorny copyright status of unpublished letters in the United Kingdom. I'm not going to talk about all of those in my talk today, but I hope we'll have a chance to have conversation either at the end of my talk today or at some point over the course of the next couple of days. Today, I'm going to think further about the relationship between letter writing and sociability, and I'm going to do that through Gaskell. So as Alison Chapman recognises, scholars of 19th century literature have recently turned their attention to social networks as they begin the work of, quote, recovering the wide range of Victorian literary sociability and its importance for literary history and genre. Such social networks can encompass anything from tightly structured fellowships and societies to just a loose collection of individuals who might share interests or values. And of course, if we're trying to recover a formal social network, that is often relatively easy. We might, for example, have a membership list. But if we're trying to recover the kinds of informal social networks that Victorian women were likely to be involved in, that's harder. And we often have to rely on private letters, especially writing, to do that. Correspondence provides descriptions of embodied social encounters, right, which are otherwise lost to us. And networks of correspondence can also diagram social connections for us too. And you can see this here with Mary Russell Mitford, and this comes from work that the Digital Mitford project has been doing over the past few years. Letter writing is also, of course, a form of socializing in its own right. So lots of Victorian relationships are instigated and sustained through letters. And we might think about a couple with strong Baylor connections here. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her husband, Robert Browning, who famously began their courtship through letter writing. But my purpose today is not to talk about Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her husband, but instead to think about Elizabeth Gaskell and the complex relationship that existed between her correspondence, her sociability, and her literary career. I'm going to argue that Gaskell was a more skilled letter writer than she's often given credit, but that we can only understand those letters if we situate them within her social network. And Gaskell is a great candidate for this kind of work because letters were so important to the development of her own career. She was a woman writer based in Manchester, and as a result, she was displaced from Britain's most influential literary and artistic circles, both by gender and by geography. And as a result, she had to really rely on letters to launch her professional life. So through correspondence, Gaskell established herself within multiple overlapping circles, forming relationships with publishers, novelists, critics, poets, and visual artists, including Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, Harriet Beecher Stowe, George Eliot, John Ruskin, and Dante Gabriele Rossetti. And on the one hand, these epistolary relationships provide Gaskell with a means of articulating her emerging identity as a professional woman writer. On the other hand, these relationships also allowed her to leverage her social capital. So Gaskell used correspondence to secure publishing and professional opportunities, to advance the career of other writers and artists, and even to intervene in public affairs. But before we think about the relationship of Gaskell's letters to her social network, we have to start by acknowledging the practical and theoretical problems that correspondence poses. So Gaskell left us with a rich collection of letters, but there are substantial gaps in the archive. And of course, these gaps are typical, right, of 19th century correspondence, but they create specific problems for us. So as Liz Stanley warns us, the relationship between those 19th century letters that survive and those that do not is largely unknowable. As a result, we can never be certain what proportion of letters from a 19th century correspondent are extant, nor whether the surviving letters are typical of that original lost corpus. And the situation is particularly acute in Gaskell's case because we know that her archive is almost certainly more lopsided and unrepresentative than many other writers from the period, because she habitually requested that correspondents destroy her letters. And so here, for example, is a letter to George Smith. And the letter tells him that he can treasure up her letter if she had marked it with a star. Otherwise, she tells him to please burn her letters and don't send them to the terrible warehouse where 20,000 letters a year are kept. And it's worth noting here that she chooses the destruction of her letters rather than the preservation as the default. Gaskell also seems to have asked her daughter Meta to destroy her letters after her death. And when Meta herself died, she left instructions in her own will that remaining personal papers should be destroyed. So thanks to Meta's bonfires, we've got no letters to Gaskell's husband, William, and very few to her children, with the exception of her eldest daughter, Marion, who seems to have disobeyed her mother's instructions, which I find humorous. And so instead of those letters to Marion, beside those letters to Marion, the most frequent correspondence in Gaskell's extant archive are not close family members, but rather her friends. So the painter Eliza Fox, who I'll talk about later, the American literary critic Charles Eliot Norton, and then somewhat ironically, given her explicit instructions, the publisher George Smith, right? So he did not obey her. But if these gaps in the archive weren't difficult enough, right, we've also got to acknowledge the theoretical challenges of working with letters. Because letters are determined by their specific moment and place of writing in a way that other texts are not, they create really sort of peculiar interpretive difficulties. Literary scholars, myself included, will cite passages in relative isolation. But we should, as Muriel Boses warns us, try to avoid viewing correspondence as, quote, a goldmine of biographical information with a fixed and univocal referential value. Even the I of any letter is a construct, crafted to meet a specific rhetorical purpose and constrained by the general generic expectations associated with the letter. So unless we're recovering what Rosemary Bodenheimer calls the very specific conditions of time and place and relationship that produce a letter, we're only ever going to approximate the meaning that it held for its original writer and recipient. Working with Gaskell's correspondence then is complicated, but it hasn't always been seen that way. Much as commentators historically underestimated Gaskell's intelligence as a fiction writer, so the rhetorical complexity of her correspondence was misjudged for many years. Her late 20th century biographer, Winifred Guerin, for example, confidently asserts that in her letters, Gaskell was herself, right? An assessment that casually conflates the I of the letters with the actual Gaskell. Similarly, even the editors of her first major letter collection, J.A.V. Chappell and Arthur Pollard, suggest that Gaskell's letters come from the pen of a very ready writer, and in their spontaneity, they give us a fine impression of the woman as she really was. So it's a statement that underplays Gaskell's skill as a letter writer, and which assumes that her correspondence is giving us access to the real woman. 14 years later, in Elizabeth Gaskell, A Portrait in Letters, we see this assessment repeated. Its editors describe Gaskell's letters as revealing, and then they argue that a glance at the cursive flow of Gaskell's handwriting is enough to show that in the great majority, she is her natural impulsive self. I think this is subtly gendered language, implying that lacking in masculine self-control, Gaskell cannot help but reveal to us her artless and linguistically incontinent self. In contrast to these earlier assessments, however, more recent scholarship, which is informed by correspondence theory, has begun to complicate our understanding of Gaskell's letters. So Deirdre Dalbertus, for example, argues that Gaskell's apparent friendly disclosure may in fact be a calculated position, with Gaskell self-consciously withholding as much as she reveals. Joanne Shattuck similarly questions how much the I of the letter is or was transparently Elizabeth Gaskell, suggesting that this I, in fact, is a carefully constructed self. So building on this work today, I want to suggest that Gaskell was not only a skilled letter writer, but that she was also something of an authority in the genre of the letter itself. Adept at using correspondence to sustain and exploit her social capital, Gaskell was also alert to the practical and theoretical challenges that correspondence poses. And in her expertise in the genre of the letter is even apparent in her fiction, most especially in Cranford, which includes a dissertation of sorts on letter writing in its 5th chapter, aptly named Old Letters. So in her discussion of changing paper stock, the development of the envelope, and the system of franks made obsolete by Rowland Hill's reforms, Gaskell connects private exchanges of family news to shifting technologies of letter writing in the 19th century. And this is a sample letter from Mary Rustin Mitford, which has one of these free franks on the envelope there. In showing us her awareness of these changes, Gaskell is demonstrating her recognition of the ways in which the material operations of the Postal Service can shape even the most intimate letters that it carries. This chapter also illustrates Gaskell's awareness of the complexities of the letter as a literary genre. Gaskell catalogues the different epistolary styles of the Jenkins families, from the rector's high literary pitch to Miss Jenkins' sesquipedalian sentences. And in doing so, Gaskell is signaling to us her recognition that letters do more than transcribe speech into handwriting. Instead, they are rhetorical construction whose writers, self-consciously or not, craft authorial personas through their stylistic choices. Gaskell also, like late 20th and early 21st century epistolary theorists, recognizes the letter as a temporarily bounded genre, one which is written at a particular time for a particular audience and purpose. So Gaskell's narrator, Mary Smith, reflects that Miss Mattie's family letters possess a vivid and intense sense of the present time, which seems so strong and full as if it could never pass away, as if the living, warm living hearts that so express themselves could never die and be as nothing to the sunny earth, before adding that she should have felt less melancholy if the letters had been more so. Like contemporary theorists of the letter, Smith recognizes old letters as inevitable sites of loss, whose original emotional import and semantic content can never be fully reproduced by subsequent readers. Gaskell's expertise in the genre of letters is also apparent in her non-fiction. So as the author of the groundbreaking Life of Charlotte Bronte, she relied heavily on correspondence to reconstruct and recount the Yorkshire novelist biography. So she's doing the same kind of work, right, that lots of us are doing. And Gaskell might have described the process of looking over, correcting, and interweaving letters into her own prose as dreary work in a letter to Emily Shane. But her use of correspondence to research and write Bronte's life reminds us that Gaskell had unusually extensive experience working with letters in a professional capacity. And when we look at the manipulation of correspondence in the biography, we can see her preference for rhetorical effect over historical accuracy. So she silently runs two of her own letters together in the Life of Charlotte Bronte as she tempers and revises her account of her first meeting with Bronte. Some of the unmarked allusions seem designed to protect the feelings of Bronte's father, Patrick Bronte, and her widower, Arthur Bell Nichols, right? So she massages her original description of Bronte's physical appearance, removing references to Bronte's reddish face, her missing teeth, and Gaskell's impression of Bronte as altogether plain. But other edits are purely stylistic. She tightens up her description of her stay with the Kay Shuttleworths, cutting extraneous details. These deletions, like her unmarked merging of two letters, demonstrate that she understands letters as rhetorical constructions, which are ripe for retrospective manipulation. And this editorializing demonstrates the clear understanding of audience and purpose that the supposedly natural and impulsive Gaskell possessed in relation to her own letters. And then furthermore, though Gaskell claimed to be emotionally scarred, right, by her experience of working in the Life of Charlotte Bronte, her interest in the letter as a literary genre didn't disappear in her later years. So as she cast about for a book project in the 1860s, she proposed a biography of the renowned and celebrated 17th century French letter writer Marie de Rabatin-Chantel, who's more widely known as Madame de Sévigné, even traveling to Normandy in 1861 to begin her research. And though she confessed to George Smith in 1862 that the life and times of Madame de Sévigné was more in her head than out of it, her description of Sévigné to William Smith Williams as, quote, like a well-known friend to me all my life, suggests that she read and reread the Frenchwoman's letters. And I would suggest that her attention to this historical figure, who is famous because of her letters, confirms Gaskell's own sustained attention to this genre. So not just as a means of conveying information or cementing social relationships, but as a distinct literary genre in its own right. And we can see this developed interest also in her own correspondence, right? So as Catherine Leviton has recognized, Gaskell has a habit of drawing her readers' attention to the practical and generic constraints that shape the content of her letters, which suggests that writing letters for her was a self-reflexive process. So she frequently comments on her writing implements, either bemoaning a bad pen or less frequently praising a delicious pen. Similarly, she regularly acknowledges the impact of the external rhythms of the daily postal schedule on her process of composition, explaining the abrupt opening of a letter to Ruskin by writing, "I must begin at once upon my subject if I am to catch today's post." When writing from rural or foreign locations, she draws her correspondent's attention to the unreliability of the local postal service, telling Edward Holland, for example, that you don't know what a broken reed you trusted to in relying on the Silverdale postman. But beyond the practical difficulties of sending letters long distances, Gaskell also specifically addresses the heightened expectations associated with such correspondence. So she writes to the Boston-based Charles Eliot Norton, for example, "I feel as if one ought to have great events to write about before beginning a letter to another continent." And so here we see Gaskell self-consciously reflecting, right, on the distance from each other as she worries, and I think facetiously, right, whether domestic news from Plymouth Grove is sufficiently momentous for a letter that will travel 3,000 miles. So given this professed and professional interest in the letter, it's unsurprising that analysis of Gaskell's correspondence reveals a highly skilled letter writer whose vivid letters were much valued by friends and acquaintances. Writing to her sister, Catherine Winkworth, in 1854, for example, Emily Shane praises Gaskell's letter writing, exclaiming that she had a delicious letter from Lily this morning. That's her Gaskell's sort of affectionate nickname. A regular folio, most about Miss Florence Nightingale, and just what one wanted to hear, not idealizing descriptions such as come first, and must always come first, but facts and details. And the wrong side of the tapestry, as well as the right, and the impression she has made on other people. And so here we see Shane really sort of delighting, right, in that pen portrait that Gaskell has supplied, while also commending Gaskell's really characteristic attention, right, to her audience. And we see Gaskell's letters described or dismissed as gossipy, but Shane's response demonstrates the skillful way in which she's using correspondence to consolidate friendships through these entertaining and insightful letters that often provide their recipients with access to the lives of Gaskell's other acquaintances. So despite the skepticism of Gaskell's 20th century editors and biographer, it's clear that Gaskell understood how to use correspondence to increase and even exploit her social capital, a practice that becomes intimately tied to her emerging professional identity in the 1850s. And it's to that professional identity, right, that I now want to turn. So though Gaskell had published poetry and several short prose pieces in the 1830s and 40s, it was the 1848 novel Mary Barton that initiated her into the world of large-scale publishers, as Shirley Foster puts it. Gaskell was still something of a novice writer, though, at this point. She wasn't familiar with the workings of the publishing industry, and she wasn't at ease with her new identity as a professional author. Living in Manchester, 200 miles from London, she depends inevitably on her correspondence network to facilitate her new career and to establish herself in Britain's literary circles. And even the publication of Mary Barton itself depends on these connections. So looking for a publisher, she sends the manuscript initially to her stepmother's sister, Catherine Thompson, who happened to be a writer. She follows Catherine Thompson's advice to revise the novel, and then she sends it again to one of her earliest publishers, William Howitt, and then he shows it to John Forster, who's a reader for Chapman and Hall. And her reliance on her correspondence network doesn't even stop at this point, right, as she begins to establish this new identity. After Chapman and Hall accept her manuscript, Howitt continues to serve as the intermediary by letter between Gaskell and Chapman Hall, helping her broker her first deal. But beyond using her letter writing skills to seek practical advice and help at the beginning of her novelistic career, Gaskell also uses correspondence to build connections with other writers, artists, and publishers. And she has a really, I think, remarkable ability to initiate apparently close friendships with other literary figures through letter writing. And we can see that in her letters to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, right? I thought we'd go local, right, for this part. So one of the things which is sad is that most of those letters to Elizabeth Barrett Browning are missing. They seem to have been caught up in Panini Browning's sale, right, of all of his effects after his death in 1913. But even without those letters, just looking at Barrett Browning's replies tells us how effectively Gaskell could build intimacy with her recipients, even in the absence of face-to-face meetings. So responding to one of Gaskell's letters, Barrett Browning comments, "How I seem to know you and to hold your hand," a statement that suggests Gaskell's letter had communicated an unusually strong sense of her embodied presence. And of course, we might say, well, that's just poetic hyperbole, right? except that the letter's content seems to confirm this impression. In a deeply personal passage, Barrett Browning tells Gaskell, a woman that she has never met, about her 4 miscarriages and her emotional response to the birth of her son. So she relates her joy at her son's successful delivery, describing for Gaskell, a fellow writer and mother, the differences between the emotions that she felt and those that she would have written in her poetry. I remember that my impulse was to leap out of bed and dance and sing. Now a solemn joy is what one should have felt. I should have written it so in a poem, but life is stronger than our art. So even without Gaskell's letters, Barrett Browning's candor speaks to the extraordinary familiarity that Gaskell's correspondence had fostered between the 2 women writers. And this is, I think, sort of confirmed by their single face-to-face meeting, right? So when we look at that one face-to-face encounter between Barrett Browning and Gaskell, we see Gaskell's skill as a letter writer and her ability to create an attractive and charming epistolary persona, right, for her audience. On her 1858 trip to Italy, Gaskell visited Barrett Browning at Casa Guidi in Florence with Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a mutual acquaintance of both. The meeting, however, did not go well, right? So Catherine Winkworth wrote home, I really only saw Mrs. Browning, for she scarcely spoke. In fact, the evening was not particularly brilliant. Mrs. Gaskell talked chiefly about Miss Bronte, in which I acted chorus. Barrett Browning, for her part, told Jane Wills Sandford that I positively, and in spite of prejudices and my own great surprise, liked Mrs. Stowe much the better. Now, should you have thought that? So Barrett Browning confesses here to being astonished that she had preferred Stowe to Gaskell when she'd liked the persona presented in Gaskell's letters so much. And I think her response is really instructive, right? It reminds us that we cannot map textual correspondence onto embodied encounters, and we can't map epistolary personas directly onto their flesh and blood writers. But it also shows us what an adept letter writer Gaskell was, able to forge warm relationships on paper, even when these in-person encounters left everyone cold. But in addition to using correspondence to establish relationships with other women writers, we also see at the beginning of Gaskell's career her using letters to articulate a new authorial persona. And I'm actually going to turn to Eliza Fox, who was also an acquaintance of Barrett Browning and who created this portrait of her. So one of her most significant early correspondents was the painter Eliza Fox, whom Gaskell knew familiarly as Totty. And Fox is a particularly interesting example for us because we've got a substantial archive of extant letters to her, which includes some of Gaskell's most famous and most frequently cited letters. So it's to Fox, for example, that Gaskell describes her great number of me's, and to Fox that Gaskell discusses the conflict that women artists face between what she calls home duties and individual life. As these letters suggest, right, Gaskell's letters to Fox have been very useful, especially for feminist critics interested in charting Gaskell's attitudes to gender. But despite the frequent citation of these letters in Gaskell's scholarship, Fox remains relatively little known. So born in 1822, Fox was the daughter of the Unitarian minister, politician, and editor, William Johnson Fox. And I have not been able to find a picture of Fox, a portrait. If anyone finds one, please let me know. But this is her portrait of her father that she created. Gaskell met Fox in 1848 on a semi-professional visit to London to promote her first novel, Mary Barton. And though Fox was 12 years younger than Gaskell, it's important for us to recognize the ways in which Fox was a more socially established and more confident woman artist than Gaskell was at this point. So Fox had already attended Henry Sasse's art school, and she explicitly saw her training not as a private accomplishment, but instead as the foundation of a professional career. So as she wrote in the Girl's Own paper in 1890, when I was in my 20th year, I had seriously taken up the study of art as a profession, rather an unusual and independent step for a girl to take when I was young, now a good many years ago. As the statement suggests, Fox was an avowed feminist, determined to forge new paths for women in the arts. In addition to this educational background, Fox was also already deeply embedded in an overlapping set of intellectual dissenting and literary artistic circles when Gaskell met her. So she grew up in a home that became, in Brenda Collins' words, quote, a West London salon visited regularly by writers, playwrights, poets, artists, and actors. After her father's partner, Eliza Flowers, died in 1846, Fox then became herself her father's housekeeper and his hostess. And so while those domestic responsibilities sometimes conflicted with her artistic ambitions, her new role also consolidated her position within an influential social network that included Harriet Martineau, John Stuart Mill, Robert Browning, William and Mary Howitt, William Macready, Benjamin Lee Smith, and his daughter, the artist and feminist Barbara Lee Smith, later Beaudeschon. So when we remember that Gaskell met Fox at the beginning of her own novelistic career, and before she had established friendships with other women writers, the meaning and the significance of this correspondence, I argue, becomes clearer. Fox was a self-identified professional woman artist with domestic responsibilities of her own. And so as a result, she was someone to whom Gaskell could candidly discuss the conflict she perceived between her existing identity as a wife and mother and her emerging role as a professional woman writer. And we see this even in her description of Fox's likely experience on her first visit to Manchester. Are you prepared, Gaskell asked, for 4 girls in and out continuously, interrupting the most interesting conversations with inquiries respecting lessons, work, etc. The picture that Gaskell is painting here offers an implicit but pointed contrast between her harried life in 42 Plymouth Grove and the composed West London salon that Fox presides over. But beyond such comparisons of Gaskell's supposedly chaotic domestic life and the gatherings of London's literary and artistic elite at Fox's home, these letters to Fox are also providing Gaskell with an important opportunity to articulate her conflicted attitude to her new authorial identity. So when Fox herself seeks Gaskell's advice about whether she should leave her father to study art in Munich in 1850, Gaskell's response pertains to Fox, but it also pertains to women artists in general and to Gaskell herself. So on the one hand, Gaskell's reply to Fox seems a retrenchment of conventional mid-Victorian gender ideology, and it echoes Robert Southey's letter to Charlotte Bronte. So she writes, "One thing is pretty clear, women must give up living an artist's life if home duties are paramount. It is different with men whose home duties are so small a part of their lives." But on the other hand, Gaskell's implicit recognition of Fox's feminism allows her to diverge from Victorian gender norms. "I am sure," Gaskell writes, "that it is healthy for women to have the refuge of the hidden world of art to shelter themselves in when too much pressed upon by daily small Lilliputian arrows of peddling care." So instead of presenting domestic life here as the natural vocation of women, unambiguously and enthusiastically embraced, Gaskell acknowledges its endless trivial distractions to Fox. But perhaps even more significantly, the Gaskell of these letters can also concede to Fox's view of the issue, agreeing that art keeps women from being morbid, as you say. And then the self-division that is hinted at in this letter then becomes a regular theme in her letters to Fox. And so it's no coincidence, right, that she wrote that famous description of herself as divided into a great number of me's in her next letter to Fox, given that Fox herself is experiencing some of these same contradictory pulls. We know that Gaskell's letters to Fox are proved really attractive to critics working on gender, right? Fox is the person who gets Gaskell to sign Barbara Lee's petition for the reform of married women's property law in 1855. But we shouldn't just take these letters at face value. We should also remember the ways in which Fox's own identity is facilitating the me that Gaskell is presenting in them. Restoring this contextual information proves particularly illuminating when we consider that most famous description of the multiple selves. So in April 1850, Gaskell wrote to invite Fox to visit her at 42 Plymouth Grove, which was the new home that she and her husband had just acquired. From the opening of the letter, however, Gaskell voices her uneasiness around her new house. She should be delighted about her new home, she tells Fox, if I had neither conscience nor prudence. As Gaskell explicitly worries whether it is right to spend so much on so purely selfish a thing as a house is, while so many are wanting. Gaskell's admission of self-division in this letter is often understood purely in terms of gender. The conflict between the me, who is a wife and mother, and the artist self with a full taste for beauty and convenience. Restoring what we know of this letter's intended recipient, however, demonstrates the complexity of Gaskell's multiple me's. So in this letter to Fox, a woman whose progressive politics extends to issues of class, Gaskell's voicing not just a perceived gender split in herself, but also an acute anxiety about the material gulf between her living conditions and those of the poor in Manchester. So much as Fox's gender politics facilitate Gaskell's incipient feminism in these letters, so Gaskell's identification of one of her me's as a true Christian, only people call her a socialist and communist, speaks directly to her awareness of Fox's own radical Unitarian background and her recognition that Gaskell shares these concerns for the lives of the poor. So Gaskell's letters were once dismissed as the hasty outpourings of a disorganized mind. Closer attention, however, reveals a skilled correspondent with a professed and professional interest in the letter as a literary genre. Far from representing the unfiltered thoughts of the real Gaskell, we should understand her letters as rhetorical constructions, which are crafted for their audience and a specific purpose. The discussions of identity, gender, and art that we find in Gaskell's letters to Fox don't emerge unprompted. They speak to Gaskell's own understanding of her audience, and most especially her sense of Fox's political and creative identity. And so as 19th century literature scholars continue the work of recovering Victorian sociability, letters undoubtedly offer us one of the best means of reproducing the era's complex and overlapping informal social networks. But by the same token, we should also recognize that these social networks present us with the best opportunity for understanding letters, that most social of genres, right, as we attempt to recover the meanings that they held for their original writers and recipients. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the goals of the symposium is to have plenty of time for discussion and conversation, which we have. So we will take questions from the audience. Jennifer has a microphone just to ensure that everyone in here can hear and on Zoom. And then for those of us in our Zoom audience, you guys can put a question in the Q&A, and we have Riley Fitzpatrick who will speak your question for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was, am I on? You are. Okay, thank you so much. That was wonderful and fascinating. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how the genre of the letter gives us another more nuanced way to think about the negotiation of public and private selves, which
Yes.
is something that is often very gendered.
Yes, no, that's a great question. And so this talk is actually from a longer chapter on Gaskell's letter, so that's great. I can talk about another section that I cut. Yes, I think the letter is fascinating, right? Because it's often, it can be an entirely private document, but which is then circulating through public channels, right? So you have that kind of interesting kind of boundary crossing there. It can also be a public document as well, right? Which is traveling through public channels as well. And we know historically that letter writing has been gendered as female. And in fact, Madame de Sévigné, right, was sort of, her letters were kind of used as a kind of letter writing manual for young women in the 18th century. And so there's this very kind of interesting kind of relationship. And when we look at sort of Gaskell herself, what becomes sort of fascinating is the ways in which she actually starts to kind of harness that. So her letters to George Smith, right, those letters that were not destroyed, she'll very sort of self-consciously move from the ostensibly private into the public, right? So she'll repeatedly say things like "now to business," right? So she'll ask about she's constantly asking about his wife and his wife's pregnancies. But then she'll sort of shift into kind of publication questions, and she'll mark those moments, right, with "now to business," right? But what's fascinating about her letters, and I do think you see the letters sort of shift right through her career, and I think she becomes more adept at manipulating the different kind of personas that she's presenting, because she actually starts to use her private self and those private parts of those letters often for public or professional ends, right? And with George Smith, especially because she had a kind of a friendship with him, she'll lean into that very heavily to basically guilt him into doing things, right? Even the very first letter that she writes to him, which has been described as like as a pitch to write a biography of Charlotte Bronte, is ostensibly about her private feelings for Bronte, right? She wants a copy of the Richmond portrait because she had such a strong emotional sort of relationship. But then she kind of slips in, and I'm thinking about writing a memoir about my experiences with Bronte, right? So she's balancing those things, I think, sort of very carefully, and she's using them. And I think what's interesting for Gaskell as well, right, is that, you know, she is you know, a woman writer in a period where how do you kind of access the public sphere, right? So, you know, you're doing it through your novels, right? But you also see her doing it with her letters, both in terms of the ways that she can manipulate those two discourses together, but also at times when she uses her letters to actually get influential men of her acquaintance to then do something, right, in the public sphere. So she does this with Ruskin, right? So she has a friend who, Alfred Waterhouse, who has been looked over in the competition to design the new law courts in London, and she writes to Ruskin, who she has a friendship with, and she's like, can you pull strings with me, right, for me? And then he gets him on the list, right? So I think it's fascinating, right? And I think that when we're thinking about that sort of opposition between the two, being alert about the ways in which that opposition will often kind of collapse, right? And that the one will actually kind of feed the other one. Yeah.
You have one on Zoom, right?
Yes, I have several in the chat. The first one is from Fred Hook. He says, thank you so much for your lecture. You briefly mentioned correspondence theory in your talk. Are there any works on correspondence theory that you would recommend to junior scholars starting work on 19th century correspondence?
Yeah, there's lots and lots, but actually to pick up on what Kristen said, which I think is really important, it's almost like hard to find them because it is spread across different kind of disciplines, right? And so some of the people I mentioned in my talk, so Muriel Boses has an article that came out in the Yale Review in 1986, which is very kind of useful, and I can share this with people. Liz Stanley has like several different kind of pieces which are very kind of helpful. And she's been working on all of Schreiner's letters, but her work thinks a lot about the kind of theoretical kind of issues of working with correspondence. More recently, there is a scholar whose name is Merrick Still Simon Martin, who has a number of, she works with Barbara Bottershaw's letters, but she's also engaging very heavily with the kind of theoretical issues. And there are sort of multiple edited collections. But one of the things I think when people are looking for these sources is recognizing that, you know, sometimes you're finding them from literature scholars, sometimes they're coming from historians, sometimes they're coming from social scientists. And I think that's one of the things that sort of makes it difficult for us to sort of find that kind of corpus, right? And think about how they're operating together.
Our other questions in the chat. The second question is from Linda Maria Grasso. She says, thank you for the wonderful talk. Why do you think Gaskell wanted her correspondence destroyed?
We're actually pretty sure we know why she wanted it destroyed. So she had been really, really traumatized by working on the life of Charlotte Bronte, right? So if you know the story, she publishes this. She runs away to Italy immediately so she doesn't have to look at her face. And then, of course, she gets sued, right? You know, by multiple people. So Mrs. Robinson, right, Branwell's supposed lover, right, is very angry about it. William Carus Williams, the Brocklehurst character, is very angry about it. And she found that very upsetting, and she sort of developed a kind of a horror, right, of her own biography being written. And we have, you know, explicit letters. She was written to by a now unknown correspondent who wanted a biography, and she literally said, I do not see why the public has any right to know about me, right? More, to get back to Ali's question, more than the public wears that I am selling them. And it is fascinating because she's someone who wrote a biography, thought about writing another person's biography, but really started to sort of jealously guard her own kind of privacy, I think, as a consequence.
We have another one in the room.
Martha, do you still have a? Yeah, I was going to ask. Thank you so much. That was both really brilliant and really helpful. So thank you. I'm really interested in this issue of trying to gauge intimacy or closeness through correspondence. And that was just a brilliant example. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how we do that when we don't have sort of evidence of an in-person meeting that we can juxtapose, because sometimes letters do seem to be really gesturing to closeness or intimacy. And I don't know, I have different thoughts about how to interpret that. try to gauge the closeness of the relationship?
I mean, I think it's really, really hard, right? Because I think this sort of characterizes all archival work, that we work with gaps, right? More than we work with kind of presence. And so I think if you don't have that example, right, with and even with the Barrett Browning, like I don't have like Gaskell's letter to her, right? So you're trying to sort of interpret that kind of silence. I think one thing which is actually useful is to not read letters in isolation, right? And so that means not just reading, Elizabeth Gaskell's letters to Tottie Fox, say, but writing the letters that she's writing to other people in the period to try and kind of gauge whether, there's a difference, right, in the persona that she is sharing with this person, right, compared to the personas that she's sharing with other people. And then I think just always being aware that we're just approximating, right, as well, because often like we just sort of don't know, right, and so we have to kind of work with that uncertainty, I think, and it is, because there are sort of ethical questions, right, as well, and I think because Gaskell died in 1865, we might not feel that those are pressing ethical questions because we're doing what she didn't want us to do, right? But some people have kind of raised that question about, should we be doing this? Should we be, if people have left things silent, right? Should we be trying to kind of unpick and kind of recover those? And so those are other things, right? The other sort of questions that we need to sort of consider, right, as we do that work.
I can just speak loudly, but there's another question from the chat. This one from Sarah Haslam. The question is, thank you, Anne. Is there evidence, do you think, of Gaskell using her letters to experiment, share, or develop her literary technique with her correspondence, whether literary or not?
Yeah, so that relationship between her letters and her fiction is really kind of fascinating. And yes, there is definitely evidence, right, that there's an overlap between the two. So if you go back to Winifred Guerin again, she'll say, oh, the eye of the letters is the same as the eye of the short stories, and it's the same as the eye of Cranford, right? And I would be really hesitant about just kind of flattening things like that out. But we do know that, I think she tries out sort of anecdotes, right, in the letters that will then kind of appear in other places. So some of her journalism, you'll see versions of it in the letters, right? So she has some pieces, or short stories that draw on her travels in Germany, and you can see details in the letters that will then kind of reappear. The Life of Charlotte Bronte is the other really good example, right? Because when she's trying to reconstruct Charlotte Bronte's life, I mean, one of the key things that she does is she goes back to her own letters, and that's where she's drawing, and she says this explicitly in a letter to George Smith as well, right? That I need to get these letters back because she herself doesn't necessarily remember all of the details, right, of her first sort of encounter, and then even parts of the letters will then kind of reappear, or parts of the fiction will reappear later, right? So her last letter to Ruskin sort of restates, right, a sort of a related anecdote to Cranford. So there's definitely sort of a porous relationship, right, between them. And I think, which I think, adds weight to the idea that these are just not these kind of, spontaneous, pieces of writing, but that there are a literary genre, right, in her mind, and that she sees it as kind of part and parcel of the same thing.
So you mentioned that Gaskell correspondence is kind of limited. So I'm curious what the process was like for you working with Gaskell's correspondence. Did you find yourself, I mean, you have the letters collected, but did you have to go to archives? How were you able to dig up some that aren't in?
Yeah, so there's sort of two sort of major kind of collections, right? So there's the 1966 letters, and then there's the further letters that came out, I think 1999, and they have most stuff, but they don't have everything. But even working, especially with the 1966 collection, I discovered they're unreliable, right? So there's a letter that she writes to Ruskin, and the way that it is printed in the 1966 version is Gaskell ends every single sentence with an exclamation mark. And actually, I have an article where I talk about her exclamation marks. And then I found the original letter and there's no exclamation marks in it. I was like, whoops. What do I do with that, right? There are also a few letters, right, scattered around various archives that have not been collected. And finding those is just a case of, you know, lots of Googling. In the UK, the National Archives tries to sort of centralize a description of where people's work is, right? And it's not foolproof, but you can find like a few letters, like, you know, I think Leeds has like 1 or 2 letters from Gaskell that hadn't been kind of collected previously. But it's really just like a lot of kind of, you know, sort of Google, and then knowing that you may well have missed things. And actually the most frustrating thing are those letters to Barrett Browning. So I know the Browning people are all going to know this, but when Barrett Browning's son died, he was declared intestate. And then so everything was, all of his possessions were auctioned off in 1913. And you can go to the Sotheby catalogue and you can see the letters, like the listing for the letters that Gaskell sent, and somebody bought them. And maybe they still exist, or maybe they don't still exist, right? It's really frustrating. So I mean, and then the other issue, I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, is that in the UK, unpublished letters that were written before 1989 are still in copyright. And so even to like republish, even just like a short quotation, you have to get permission from the copyright holder. And really, really fortunate with Gaskell, her descendant gets back to you really fast on email and is really kind of helpful. But I had to quote something from Barbara Bodishaw, and her descendant like took months to, and it's stressful because your publishers are like, well, don't you have your permission sorted now, right? So all kinds of just practical issues, yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your discussion and speaking to Elizabeth Gaskell as a skilled letter writer and how she grew. And you mentioned reading this Lavini's letters, those training materials. Did you come across much other sort of what training materials, how she would have practiced and grown and improved her letter writing?
Yeah.
Those lines?
So where I sort of see that is almost in where you kind of chart how she grew, right? And I do think the letters to her publishers are like the great sort of example of that, because so initially with Edward Chapman, right, who's her first publisher, first of all, she's getting William Howitt to do most of the negotiation for him. But when she's writing to Chapman, she's like constantly kind of confessing her lack of knowledge, right, to him. So he says he wants her to write an explanatory preface, and she says, "What's an explanatory preface?" Right? I don't know what that is. And he sort of famously kind of pays her very badly, right? So she gets like £100 for Mary Barton, and it's such a low sum for that novel that other people gossip about how badly she was have done. But in the letter, she's like, "Oh, I'm so glad it's making so much money for you." And that's where you see the shift, right? Because whereas with George Smith, she gets really, really smart, right? So Samson Lowe, the American publisher, approached her to write a 3-volume novel in 1859, and they offer her £1,000. And then she immediately writes to George Smith saying, "Well, I've been offered this, but I'd much rather publish with you, right? Because I like you so much more." And you can see that she's got really kind of smart about doing those things. Like she's just kind of learned the profession. And then by the end of her career, she becomes the person that other people are writing to for help and advice, right? So, you know, she helps out, Dante Gabriele Rossetti has Early Italian Poets, which is a collection of translations, and she reviews his proofs for him. She gives him advice. He contemplates sending her Goblin Market to get it published in the Cornhill magazine, right? And so she's just able to present herself like as a much more kind of professional person than she was earlier on.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. And my background's in theology and scripture. And so we look at a figure like the Apostle Paul, who's writing letters, and correspondence theory being applied to that, and how the implications of that when we talk about me's and personas and the I and rhetorical positioning. We already do a lot of work with Paul and rhetoric, and but this really just opens up a whole new many different avenues in this level of inquiry. So press on.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And this is to build on his comment. Can you tell us a little bit more, especially for the novices in the room? When did letter writing become considered a literary genre? And give us a little more.
I mean, I mean, maybe we go back to Paul, right, to do that. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think you can go, I mean, you know, I think we probably can go back kind of centuries, right, to sort of think about that. And I think maybe the difference between the kind of the open sort of letter or kind of a public letter, right, and personal correspondence, maybe that's the kind of the key shift, right? Because I think what's maybe more sort of less intuitive for us to kind of think about is the fact that private writing could also be a literary genre, right? I think we're sort of used to the idea that something is meant for public circulation would be literary genre. And so there, I think we're probably really sort of thinking kind of 17th, 18th century, right? And I think a lot of it, I mean, the thing which is interesting is it is this genre which is associated with women, and that the idea that women should be able to write good letters, right? You know, middle and upper class women, that becomes sort of part of your education, right? Part of your training, I think, really from the 17th and definitely sort of from the 18th century onwards. And then I think the thing which is interesting when we're thinking about Gaskell, right, is that the penny post comes in 1840, right? And with the penny post, where you can send a letter anywhere in the UK for 1 pence, which is massively dropping the price, right, of postage, is that suddenly people are sending so many more letters. And in London, we know that there's like 12 postal deliveries a day, right, which is amazing. But what that also means is that not all letters fit that kind of prior sort of model of what letter writing should look like, because they're not always going to be these sort of considered documents where you're drawing on the training, right, that you got as a young woman to write them. Because the post is so frequent and so cheap, it might just be, can you come to tea? Right? And it's operating much more like a text message, right, say nowadays. And then that also, I think, raises questions about kind of what gets archived and what gets put in collections, because historically, those kind of sort of more sort of domestic or apparently more kind of ephemeral letters have been the ones that haven't been collected, haven't been studied, haven't really been kind of thought about. And so I think when we think of the letter as a literary genre, we actually have to start kind of breaking down the letter, right, into different kind of categories and thinking what it means to think about the letter in that way according to those different categories.
There's a additional comment from Sarah Haslam, who says, I was just going to say that huge and immediate rise in post. Also, Catherine Sutherland is good on the literarification, if that is a word, of letters in the 18th century in her book, Why Modern Manuscripts Matter.
The question, I'll jump in. So I was really struck by your sort of theorizing and the importance of thinking about the context of a letter, because I too am very guilty about loving this one sentence and I pull it out and I build it all, do the detective work of what's going on around it. But I do believe wholeheartedly what you're saying. Like, I'm very convinced, despite the fact that I probably still won't always do that. But my question then is about how we as a scholarly field, and even thinking more about sort of like public facing humanities too, as we're curating these letters and writing about them and talking about them, and some of us working on digitization projects, what is the role of those kinds of collections in helping identify that larger context? And is there a way in your mind that we could reimagine how collections of letters work to sort of supply some of that context or point people in the right directions? Because it does seem like it's a gap in the collections themselves, maybe.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good question. I mean, and because there is this sort of practicality, like every time you cite a letter when you're writing about something else, you can't really do a digression, right? Or have extensive, you know, really sort of extensive kind of footnotes in terms of doing that. So, I mean, I think it's a sort of a couple of things. I think it's one, actually going back and reading the whole letter, And because there's I will not be able to remember sort of my head, but there's a famous sort of quote from Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, where she's talking about, why can't women do these professions, right? And it often gets cited in isolation. But if you go and read the whole letter, she's then like, oh, but these are the reasons why we can't do it. And it looks quite different, right? Once you put it in that context. So I think partly it's sort of making sure that we're sort of doing that work. And maybe this is, where we're thinking about our scholarship existing kind of digitally, where people are able to, read our work and then kind of connect through to an archive, right, and to see the whole letter, or thinking about the kinds of contextual work, right, that archives might do around letters as well. And then the Digital Mitford project, which I've been involved in, which is basically kind of involved in kind of digitizing, creating a collection of Mitford's letters. The other thing is to sort of think about the tools that we have digitally, and the things that we can do. So they've become very interested in the ways that we can sort of map relationships, right? And I showed you kind of a sample of that, right? That you can actually sort of dynamically produce these networks, right, to show who people are writing to and the frequency. I think if we're digitizing letters and, who knows what AI is going to do, but things like TEI, right, which allows you, to tag terms, to tag people, to include some kind of biographical information, but then allows you to do kind of searches where you could look for clusters of peoples or clusters of terms. That kind of work where we can do those sort of contextual readings that doesn't involve us going and reading, doing it as reading all of those letters, but some kind of tool that makes it faster for us to do that, right? So maybe thinking about those kind of strategies and techniques. Yeah.
We have a good amount of time for maybe 2 or so questions left. So either on Zoom or.
There's one on Zoom from Sarah Haslam. A follow-up on the last question. Are you concerned about the preservation of Gaskell's letters in the archives?
I don't think so. I mean, I think where they're held, I think they're being sort of looked after, right? So that's not a concern. And actually, one of the things I was talking to people about earlier, one of the sort of the nice things, and this is like the one good thing that came out of COVID, is that I think that those letters and archives are much more accessible to us than they used to be. And so, it's now become like they will let you take photos in archives, right, which is huge. But if you can't get to an archive, it's now much more likely that they will send you a digital copy, right? So that obviously makes a huge sort of difference. I think my concern is, and this is just sort of inevitable, is how do we find those remaining letters that haven't been collected, right? And I think that's a really sort of difficult kind of ask, right? And you just have to hope that those sort of things turn up. We just don't know what's in private collections. We don't know if the private collectors themselves even know what they have. So yeah, but yeah, in general, not too concerned.
This was great. I have maybe a theoretical question about the sort of tendency, I would say, to treat letters as a feminine genre in the sort of present day methodologies of reading, to kind of go into it thinking that there's something sort of feminine about the letter form when we know that the men are the ones who are the first to be literate, and to be able to communicate in some ways. What do you make of the density of that presumption?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really useful point, right? And I think sometimes when we have those ideas, we're kind of responding to conduct manuals and things like that, right? That are feminizing the letter. And actually, that's one of the sort of really interesting things that the Mitford project discovered, right? Because in archiving these letters and in building the archive in a way that you could sort of chart these networks, is what they discovered was that she was actually extremely well embedded in a network of male writers and male figures, and she was writing to more men than she was writing to women. And actually, and that's sort of in part actually in my book, like what I was sort of trying to do was to say that it's actually very dangerous, I think, for us to kind of silo women writers in the 19th century from male writers in the 19th century, because they're actually part of these same kind of networks, and that it's really important that we recover those networks and that we recognize how significant men were to women's writing, but also women were to men's writing too. Yes, I think that's where the archive can kind of belie the way that the culture itself might have presented a genre. Yeah.
Any last questions? Time.
Related to the previous question, but I'm wondering how the role of fame
Uh-huh.
sort of shapes the theory of letter writing. I kind of read letters by nobodies most of the time, and haven't really engaged with this theory much. So I'm wondering, because they're more historically archivally significant, you would have a larger corpus of their letters, and also if they're largely literary figures, then it would make it more a different writing form, and possibly being concerned of the publicity of them.
Yeah. No, I think that's huge. I think it's huge in the period when they're writing, right? Because you know, if you're Ruskin, or you know, if you're Carlyle, Lewis Carlyle, you know, he writes to Gaskell right after Mary Barton comes out, and because he has fame in the period, he can write to this writer, right? And then we will preserve that correspondence, right, in a way that we wouldn't have done otherwise. And you're right, there are also people who are skilled writers too, right? That they have that kind of skill. And I think again, it's just this point where we're sort of thinking about, to get back to what I said earlier, those gaps and absences, right? We don't have Toti Fox's letters to Gaskell, right? So we've got one half of a correspondence because one of those people was famous, right? And the other person was not as famous. And so it becomes difficult. And I think also, you know, when we're thinking about you know, some people, you know, many people work on people who are not famous, right? But I think we look at those letters differently because we're often looking to see ways in which they typify an experience, right? Whereas when we know who Elizabeth Gaskell was, is we really want to individualize those letters, right? Rather than seeing them as typical, right, of an experience. And so I think it's just trying to kind of keep all those things in mind, right? And sort of see all our pronouncements as being kind of provisional.
You all would join me in thanking Anne.